In this episode of True Crime Black, we look at the case of a black girl who went missing. After getting into an argument with her mom, she walked out of the house and was never seen again. The police were baffled as to what could have happened to her. They even began to suspect that someone closer to her knew a lot more than they were willing to share. But was that the case? Let's find out. In 2017, a family was hopeful. They thought that, after nearly 30 years, they'd finally found their missing loved one. The woman was the same age as their missing loved one would be. The woman had the same name as their loved one, though she spelled it slightly differently. She even looked like a spitting image of some of the members of the family. It had to be her, right? Sadly, it wasn't. The woman's birth certificate would prove that she wasn't the adult version of the missing child they'd been looking for. So what is the family to do now? How are they supposed to find their missing child? It would seem that their last hope is for someone to hear the story and remember something that could bring some answers. This is the case of Daffany Tullos. 7-year-old Daffany Tullos spent her childhood living with her grandparents, John and Shirley Tullos. The couple raised her in Jackson, Mississippi. Even though she was being raised by her grandparents, Daffany's mother, Robbie Tullos, lived close by and she would make sure to visit her as often as possible. She would visit her one evening, and the events of that night was the catalyst for the case. On July 26, 1988, Robbie went to the house to see Daffany, as well as her 2-year-old twins. While Robbie was in the process of making dinner for her little ones, Daffany approached her. She told her mother that she was hungry and wanted food too. Robbie told her that she already ate dinner and wasn't going to get any more food. After going back and forth with her daughter for a short bit, Robbie caved and gave Daffany a fish stick. Daffany, upset that she had only gotten a little bit of food, took the fish stick and walked out the door. Robbie thought that her daughter was just going to step outside and blow off some steam in the front yard. Part of what gave her that assumption was that Daffany never put on any shoes before she walked outside. For that reason, Robbie didn't follow after her or check on her for a while. This all took place after 7 p.m. that night. Some of Daffany's friends would later say that they saw her walking away from her home and down the street. It would start to get dark after 8 p.m., which was typically a signal for Daffany that it was time to return home. Oddly, she was nowhere to be found. Robbie went outside and didn't see her in the yard. She looked for her throughout the neighborhood and could find no trace of her. Growing concerned, Robbie called the Jackson Police Department for help. From the start, this case was hard for Robbie. She had to be upfront with the police that Daffany did leave the house on her own and intentionally. The sticking point, though, is that Daffany never told her mother or anyone else where she was going. In fact, no one can say for sure how far she actually made it down the street. The most the police had to go off of was the statement from her friends that said they'd seen her about 4 blocks from her house. After that, it is unknown what happened to her. Refreshingly, the police were taking this case seriously from the start. Despite the fact that there was no reason at that point to suspect any foul play, the police were feeling pressure to find Daffany immediately because of her young age. A search of the area was conducted very quickly. The police were expecting to find the young girl hiding somewhere and still upset after having an argument with her mother. The concern was now growing on their end though, when the search concluded with the police finding no trace of Daffany Tullos. They were now starting to believe that something more serious may have happened. That would partially be because of Daffany's medical condition. Daffany had been diagnosed with epilepsy. She was required to take several different medications to help stave off her chances of having seizures. When Daffany left the house, she didn't take any of that medication with her. The police continued their search for Daffany spanning 72 hours. Their efforts were continuous and non-stop. Sadly, it was to no avail. They had covered a 6-block radius surrounding Daffany's home and still were not able to come up with any clues or indication as to where she had gone. Even though there was still no evidence to suggest foul play, the increasingly prevailing thought among everyone involved was that Daffany had been abducted. On July 29, 3 days after she'd left her home, the police once again canvassed the neighborhood. This time, they went to each family's door and handed out flyers and asked questions. They also made them aware of the $2,500 reward being offered for information leading to Daffany being found. Frustratingly, no one in the area had seen or heard anything. The investigators began looking at members of Daffany's family. Specifically, they were theorizing that she may have been taken by her biological father. He had not been part of Daffany's life, and didn't even live in Jackson, Mississippi. After their interview with him, they were quickly able to surmise that he had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance. Daffany's grandmother was sure that something horrible had happened. She knew that Daffany was afraid of the dark and would never choose to be outside after the sunset. Luckily for the family, several tips were being called in regarding Daffany's disappearance. Many people were calling in to say that they had seen Daffany in different parts of Jackson. One woman in particular said that she was certain that she spotted Daffany at a park with an adult male. According to the woman, Daffany was uneasy being with the man and appeared to be crying. The police followed up on all of the leads, but were unable to confirm any of the sightings. It turns out that the woman did see a young girl crying with an adult male, but it wasn't Daffany. A young girl who looked nearly identical to Daffany was leaving the park with her father. She was crying because she wasn't ready to go home yet. Then, new information would change the direction of the case. The detectives were made aware of an incident that took place just about a month earlier. On June 29, 1988, Daffany stayed over at her mother's apartment for the night. She would later tell her aunt that, while she was sleeping that night, she was woken up out of her sleep by something traumatic. Her mother's boyfriend, Ernest Lee Epps, was in her bed and fondling her. Daffany's aunt immediately went to the police and told them what happened. They interviewed Ernest, who denied the allegations. However, he was still arrested and charged on July 8. He was subsequently released after posting his $1,000 bond on July 26. That was the same day that Daffany disappeared. The investigators started to suspect that maybe Ernest had been watching Daffany and waiting for an opportunity to grab her. Although he was out of jail, he was still going to be put on trial for allegedly molesting Daffany. If she were not around to testify, then the charges would most likely be dropped. Daffany's mother disagreed with the investigators' direction. She was adamant that Ernest had never acted inappropriately with Daffany or their twins. She would even take a polygraph test to support her claims. Interestingly, she revealed that she failed the polygraph. She says that the only reason she failed was because of her emotional state due to her daughter's disappearance. Shirley, Daffany's grandmother, told a story that she believes may have cost her granddaughter. According to Shirley, Ernest and his family approached her shortly after he had been arrested. They offered her $175 to drop the sexual battery case against Ernest. Shirley refused, and then Daffany disappeared not too long after. Shirley now wonders if her rejection of their offer led to the disappearance of her granddaughter. Ernest would remain a person of interest in the case in the meantime. The priority for the investigators was determining just what happened to Daffany after she left her house that evening. Shortly after her daughter's disappearance, Robbie received a strange phone call. She told the police that someone called her and told her that she needed to bring $5,000 to an address of their choosing. Once she brought the money, the caller would reach out again and tell her where she could find Daffany. As soon as the police were told this story, they went to the address. It turns out that it was the home of an elderly couple who had no idea what was going on. The phone call was a hoax. This was now making the case more frustrating. The investigators had reached the 2-week mark when they started to acknowledge that hope was dwindling. If Daffany were still alive, she had been without her medication for long enough that it was possible she could die from a seizure. Detectives felt that they had exhausted all available leads, and following up on them led to nothing but dead ends. They had no evidence and no suspects. Daphne's grandparents believed that they had a suspect. They were becoming increasingly sure that Ernest had something to do with her disappearance. They believed that the sexual battery case was the reason as well. The police were also starting to believe that, and they set their sights on Robbie as a result. They believed that Robbie had more knowledge than she was sharing and that she was protecting her boyfriend from going to prison. Daphne's grandparents didn't agree with that. They admitted that they felt Robbie had a soft spot for Ernest that often blinded her to reality, but wouldn't entertain the possibility Robbie would let anyone harm her child. Robbie was confused by the sudden suspicion. She expressed that she was confused as to why the police thought she had more knowledge than she was sharing. She had been interviewed several times and was beginning to understand that she was under suspicion. She just couldn't understand what she did to give detectives the impression that she was hiding something. She agreed with the general sentiment that it seemed like a strange coincidence that Daphne disappeared the same day Ernest got out of jail. However, she still didn't believe that he did anything to her. Then, 5 months after Daphne's disappearance, a tip came in. A woman called the police and told them that she and her boyfriend saw a man dump the body of a little girl in a field. They claimed that this happened right around the time that Daphne had disappeared. With that being the first tip that detectives had in weeks, they immediately followed up with the couple. They were shown the location of the field and searched it relentlessly. Sadly, they found nothing. Then, in February of 1990, one of Daphne's sweatshirts was found in a neighbor's yard. The police took it as evidence, but were skeptical that it was relevant to the case. Daphne had gone missing during the summer when she would have been wearing shorts and sleeveless shirts. It turns out that the police were correct. There was no forensic evidence found on the sweatshirt. Robbie would end up taking another polygraph test, but this time she felt she was a lot calmer. She passed. That, and the lack of evidence, led the investigators to move away from the theory that Robbie and Ernest had something to do with Daphne's disappearance. With little to work with, the case went cold. Tragically, it would remain that way. Daffany Tullos' case is often tied to another missing persons case that took place on the same day. 72-year-old Annie Laurie Heron was the wife of wealthy businessman Robert Heron. They had been married for 48 years. On the afternoon of July 26, 1988, Annie was abducted. After calling several friends and family and still not finding where she was, Robert called the police to report his wife missing. Investigators discovered drops of blood on the carpet and blood smears on the front door of the residence. Neighbors would also report seeing a suspicious pickup truck and a white van with Florida plates driving by her home. Detectives believe that Annie may have been struck on the head by an intruder, as indicated by blood smears on the door. A ransom note was also found near the door, which was typewritten and contained numerous grammatical and spelling errors. The note read, "Mr. Robert Heron, put these people back in the shape they was in before they got mixed up with school pictures. Pay them whatever damages they want and tell them all this so then can know what you are doing, but don't tell them why you are doing it. Do this before 10 days pass. Don't call police." Robert paid the money and still never saw his wife again. He would eventually die of a heart attack and Annie was declared legally dead in 1991. As the years went by, Ernest would die, and Daphne would remain missing. The case has gone through waves of being inactive and finding rejuvenation. Sadly, there have been no viable suspects or tips that would change the course of things. To this day, the case of Daffany Tullos remains unsolved.